Nobody saw the confirmation.
Are you reading first?
Oh, you're first.
Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome. We're glad you're here. This is Modern Times. We're the oldest collectively run bookstore in the Mission. This is our fancy events calendar. We're having a party next week at El Rio, which we're really excited about. Daphne Gottlieb, Eric Lyle, Chris Carlson, Julia Serrano, and Marge Nelson are reading. The drinks will be cheap. There will be things raffled. It'll be exciting. And there's a few more events left this month, not many. So if you want to grab one on the way out. Also, if you would like to sign up for the mailing list, I will send you a single email a month about what's going on in the store. We're excited to have everyone. Jeff, I don't have bios for anyone, so you're going to do this yourselves. And just so you know, we have, I think, a few copies of everyone's on the table there, if you want to grab one. Jeff?
Maybe we don't need the mic, I don't know. Like the mic feels weird. Do you think we need the mic?
Is it on right now?
I think it's on.
Hello.
It's on.
Mic it. Why not, dude?
We didn't have a mic, so let's use it.
Use the mic, yeah.
We love the mic.
La 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 la.
This is for later. I'll read some Fuji poems.
So, last time, I think that was like about a month ago or something, I read this story that was kind of funny, I guess. People laughed. So I thought I'd just read something like try to make everybody cry. That's the goal. But this is my collection of short stories. It's called Mormonia, and it's 7 short stories. And the last one is I guess, kind of like a novella, because it's a really long short story. And it started out as like a 20-page short story, and then it became like an 80-page short story, and then it became an 800-page novel. So it's just kept like growing. So I guess I just really liked this character, and just kept kind of going back to him and adding and adding and adding. So I'm going to read, and let's see. This story actually takes place in Mormonia, which is Utah, and the main character is Richard, and he's 19, 20 years old, and he's a Mormon, and he's at BYU, which is like the Mormon school, and he's met this girl, and then he goes off on a mission to Norway, and I think that's about all you need to know. Oh, so RMs, that's returned missionaries, and Y is BYU, so. Is this better? 8 months after his birthday, Richard stopped receiving letters from Sister Rasmussen. He was so busy he hadn't noticed at first, but one night he stopped to check the postmark, counted backwards, and realized it had been nearly 3 weeks since he'd heard from her. Since telephone contact was verboten, there was no way to reach her directly. In the absence of any communication, he had to assume she'd finally lost her patience. Perhaps she'd caught the eye of another more available man, and with him benched for the foreseeable future, she'd once again begun dating. Which, if he'd been honest with himself, was exactly what he'd encouraged her to do. But now he felt needy. He felt possessive and alone. He started thinking jealous thoughts about all those RMs at the Y, the way they swaggered across the quad like they owned the place. She would have been easy pickings. Oh God, what was he doing here in the cold? He was miserable and in a perpetual state of indigestion, and he still hadn't converted anyone. All that remained now was a Dear John letter. He girded his loins, but the letter didn't arrive. Despite 2 additional letters addressed and sent her way in the waning days of January, he did not hear back from her. He felt discouraged. His disappointment was affecting his ability to concentrate on his mission work. It was having a material impact as well on the strength of his testimony. One day in early February, a mysterious letter arrived in a pink envelope. At first, he didn't recognize the name on the return address, Catherine Rasmussen. He thought maybe it was one of Karen's elaborate jokes, but then he thought, Catherine is Katydid, Karen's younger sister, though she must not have been so young anymore. The writing on the envelope still looked like a little girl's, but why would Karen leave it up to her to break up with him? That was too cold, not at all like the Karen he'd known. Katie was precocious, a homeschool kid who liked to knit and who always seemed to hang around the periphery during his visits, as if she were a spy employed by her parents to keep tabs on them. But what did she know about breakup letters? Richard felt his heart rise in his throat. He tore open the letter, quickly scanned down the page. He couldn't believe what he was reading. Karen and her mother had been in an automobile accident. He hadn't felt it. He thought he was so attuned to the spirit. While her mother had mostly recovered, Karen was still in a coma. Concussion and multiple fractures, neck and skull. Why hadn't he felt it? Katie wrote that the doctors did not expect her to make it. He had to reread that sentence backward and forward. It didn't make any sense. It was an anagram. Something here was missing, completely off. Why hadn't he felt it? Richard was so angry now, he balled up the letter and threw it across the bedroom. He was mad at Karen, mad too at God, but mostly he was angry at himself. He felt guilty for all the negative thoughts he'd entertained in the days since her last letter, all the fantasies that had led him to believe she was actually ever capable of betraying him. His first impulse was to get on the next flight home, to raise and heal her by his own hands, command her like a modern-day Jesus, to be whole and to rise, to walk again like Lazarus, except, well, she wasn't dead, not yet. He retrieved the letter, frantically checked the postmark. It had been 8 days since it was sent. He felt a pain in his chest as it suddenly occurred to him that she could be dead. And skipped forward. So he stays in the mission. He comes back. His first day back in 6 fresh inches of snow. The skylark fishtailed up Highland Drive. Karen's mother answered the door. She nodded solemnly, thanked him for coming, but wouldn't meet his eyes. Finally, she embraced him, told him he looked good, that it was nice of him to stop by. "She'll want to see you," she said. Ingrid wore a scar on her face running lengthwise from jaw to the right corner of her mouth. Paper thin and fragile, she hobbled down the hallway, left leg shorter than her right. Richard followed. It was dark in there. It smelled like a hospital, like medicine and disease, and he couldn't help but hold his breath and then feel guilty, of course, for doing it. And trying to relax, he was suddenly aware he was breathing too much, being too casual about things, which wasn't the pose he wanted either. "Honey, we have company," Ingrid announced. She stopped outside the door, looked up at Richard as if to prepare him for what waited inside. Then she opened it. Even before he entered the room, Richard could hear the hum, a low vibration followed by an occasional fill, the insistent beep of equipment, all the machines that kept her alive. He stepped through the doorway, but had a hard time focusing on the bed at first. His eyes had to adjust to the low winter light across the room, each slant like a shard of ice coming in from upturned blinds. Carl Rasmussen sat in a rocker in the corner, a knitted throw on his lap, head bowed as if in prayer, or perhaps he was just taking a nap. Richard entered and Carl started, looked up and smiled slowly as if he only vaguely recalled who he was. Richard nodded grimly, gritting his teeth. Katie, too, though he hardly recognized her, she'd grown so much, stood on the other side of the bed, smiling wanly when she saw him. "Look who's come to see you," Katie said helpfully. It was only then that Richard lowered his gaze to the bed. Sister Rasmussen. He wouldn't have recognized her, but surely this was her unless it was all an elaborate hoax. He struggled to recall the last time he'd seen her. Crying at the airport terminal, was that it? Pointing at her promise ring as she boarded the plane? He looked at her pale, plump hand, relieved to see she no longer wore the ring. Then he felt guilty for thinking that. Felt a pang of grief for all the petty thoughts he'd had about her, given her present predicament. He wondered, had she known she would never see him again? How could she have? It was a ridiculous thought, and yet, as he stood there gathering the strength to approach, he had to think it. Slowly, he stepped forward, hand on the rail of the bed to balance himself, finally touching her gummy hand. It was cold. He couldn't help but think, she doesn't know me from Adam. Sister Rasmussen's head was turned away from him. She seemed to be staring at the bookshelf in the corner of the room, not with any intention, but simply because it was there. Her hair was clipped short, appeared redder now, more so than he remembered. He'd always thought she was a blonde, but maybe it was more of a light strawberry color when they met. She'd gained a lot of weight, too. It hung around her neck. Without warning, she began to cough, and her family circled the bed. Richard looked around the room, alarmed. "She's trying to say something," Katie said. Sister Rasmussen emitted a low, gravelly sound, as if her mouth was full of marbles. Richard practically lost it right then and there. A big shuddering wave of anger directed at no one, perhaps, but himself and God. Of course, God was complicit because he couldn't understand a word she was saying. It was awful, really, and it was awful, really, for the Rasmussens to pretend otherwise. "Richard," he started, face blanched, felt the hair on his back stand up. It was her father. Carl wanted a word with him. Outside the room, he clasped Richard's neck, leaned in and said in a voice nearly as gravelly as his daughter's, "Would you mind giving her a blessing, old sport? I know that's what she wants." He'd come prepared, had thought all along that's what he'd been called there to do, and yet when he stepped over that threshold, he instantly thought better of it. They returned to the room. Karen appeared to be looking right at him, mouth open. Carl urged him forward. He removed from his pants pocket a small vial of consecrated oil and emptied its contents on the top of her hair. He and Brother Rasmussen then placed their hands upon her head. She squirmed a little, but they held firm, bowed their heads, and Richard almost froze. Then he found the words, "Lord, inside this woman somewhere is the beautiful spirit I once knew. Lord, if it be thy will, by the power of the Holy Ghost, which is vested in me, I command her to be whole again." It wasn't the first blessing she'd received, nor would it be the last. And it wasn't the fiery rise he'd always planned on giving her. Such a prayer under the circumstances would have been foolish, maybe even unkind. And yet, at the end of his prayer, everyone turned expectantly toward Karen anyway, waiting with some small hopefulness for any sign this special blessing coming from someone she'd loved so dear would have a more immediate ameliorative effect. Nothing changed, however, and soon afterward she began to drool, and then she started to cough and scream. It was more than Richard could bear. He excused himself, cut the reunion short, and ran out of the room. Thank you. So I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our next reader. It is Keely Heisog, and her book is Things I Say to Pirates on Nights When I Miss You, the Michael J. Rubin Award winner. Poet, here she is. Please give her a warm hand.